Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. If everyone could take their seats. My name's Jennifer Peterson. I'm the Assistant Director of Next Generation here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to this evening's program, A Brave New World, Democracy and Big Data. If you're interested in this program, please consider returning to the Council on March 18 for the Artificial Intelligence Arms Race with Amy Webb from the Future Today Institute. Before our introducer for the evening joins us, please note that today's event is on the record and being live streamed. And while we always appreciate and encourage your social media engagement, please silence your phones at this time. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you to our members and audience today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're interested in learning more about membership opportunities at the Council, please see one of our young professional ambassadors, Inab, sitting over here to my left, following the program. I'd also like to thank, a big thanks to the emerging leaders and the alumni who are in the room tonight. The Emerging Leaders Program is a key part of the Council's work in developing young leaders in the city of Chicago. I'll also note that our application for the next class is open until Monday, so please apply if you're interested. We will mark the program's 10th anniversary during the networking reception, which follows this evening's program, and we hope you will join us in celebrating this occasion with us. Towards the end of the program, we will be taking audience questions from the room and online. You'll see this on your screens here, but if you'd like to go through online, it's chi.cnf.io. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Council Board Member and Emerging Leaders Program alum, John de Blasio, who will introduce tonight's panelists.
Hi, good evening, and thanks for coming. Tonight's discussion is both timely and important as it gets to the heart of a debate that is all too often dominating the news cycle. It's democracy and big data and privacy. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank the Aspen Institute Socrates Program. Tonight's event is a partnership between the Aspen Socrates Program and the Council's Next Gen initiative. It's a continuation of a long relationship between the Aspen Institute and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Both organizations have a lot of founding members and a lot of collective DNA. And founded in 1996, the Socrates Program is a global leadership forum designed to provide emerging leaders values and ethics-based learning through expert, moderated, text-based Socrates discussion on contemporary topics. Notably, a Socrates Program attendee, me, also became involved with the Emerging Leaders Program at the Chicago Council and came up with this idea that these two programs had a lot of symbiotic values and interests and would be a good collective partnership. So about 6 years ago, we began to bring emerging leaders out to Aspen to participate in the Summer Socrates Program. And then last year, we decided we'd bring Socrates to Chicago so that we could have more participants. We have several participants who have been out to Socrates in the summer. Lincoln Ellis is here. Jordan Shields is here. Zach Egan is here. I think he also attended. So we have a lot of seedlings planted that will hopefully grow into trees that will develop a stronger partnership over time. Tomorrow morning, we'll have a small group of Chicago Counseling Emerging Leaders as well as Aspen Socrates constituents join and spend the whole day talking about this critical issue of big data, privacy, and democracy. So now back to our program, a few words about our speakers. We have Elizabeth Banker. Elizabeth is the Vice President and Associate General Counsel at the Internet Association, where she focuses on data privacy and security and intermediary liability issues. Adrian Shahbaz is the Research Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House, where he oversees the research output of Freedom House's annual assessment of global Internet freedom. Michelle Richardson is the director of the Data and Privacy Project, where she leads the Center for Democracy and Technology efforts to create a user-centered internet. And our moderator is former Counsel Emerging Leader Lauren Bean Buitta, who is the founder of Girl Security, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit committed to educating girls about national security. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers and enjoy the evening.
I guess I'll start by thanking everyone for joining us tonight. I want to recognize that it is International Women's Day and to acknowledge the remarkable work of women with the Chicago Council. We have a massive topic to undertake today, big data and democracy. What I find most interesting about big data and democracy is the fact that big data as a concept has become increasingly less defined. It's become an umbrella term for a lot of different issues. Yet at the same time, the effects of big data on our democracy are becoming strikingly acute. Each day there's some new revelation as a result of big data. So I thought what would be helpful for us as the audience is for each of you to start by sharing one or two points based on both your experience and insights, but also your institutional perspective as well. Elizabeth, do you want to start?
Sure. It is a big topic. And I think from the internet industry's perspective, one of the things that's really critical is for companies that have such user-centric, user-driven products, maintaining user trust is critical. And I think that's really, we're at a real point of criticality in terms of the level of trust in the products and services that have become such an important part of people's lives. I would say, though, this isn't necessarily a tech-only problem. In fact, I think, even among the Internet Association, a number of our members exist both in the offline and online world. So, Postmates, there are actual brick and mortar establishments that have an internet component for the delivery. And we see this in so many different facets of our lives that if we talk about solutions, if we want to do right by consumers, we really need to look for a holistic online, offline, cross-sector approach to privacy that gives consumers a really consistent set of expectations about how their data will be used and what rights they have. And that's something IA is supporting at the federal level right now.
Adrian?
Sure. So I'm here representing Freedom House, which is a pro-democracy organization founded in 1941. And so we certainly approach this issue through the lens of, is the internet helping or hurting democracy, both at home and the promotion of democracy overseas? And I think that with the internet, very early on, I was an early internet user and certainly one of these kind of techno-optimist geeks who was using the internet and discovering that it was really increasing my ability to learn new things, connect with people all around the world. And when we thought about the impact that the internet was going to have on democracy, I think the first thing in our minds was it's going to make everything more transparent. There's going to be sort of a direct democracy. We're going to be so much better in touch with our local representatives. So it's really going to be a boon for democracy. And that's why when we're looking at the promotion of internet freedom around the world, or essentially the idea that everyone around the world should have access to a free and open internet. The idea was that this was going to help support democracy promotion overseas. And there were some early instances in Iran in 2009, throughout the Arab Spring, where technology was certainly used to organize and document protests. But I think since then we've seen events like Cambridge Analytica, the rise of fake news, both in the United States and all around the world. And instead, it's become apparent that the internet can really disrupt democracy as much as it can destabilize dictatorships. So for Freedom House, it's become very important that when the internet has arrived and as the internet is increasingly fused with sort of our offline lives, that when we talk about the internet, it's very important all of the human rights that we are all entitled to offline through things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the ICCPR, that we translate those rights to the online world. And I think that when it comes to certainly big data, privacy, freedom of expression, we're not yet at a point where we can say for sure that our rights are more protected online than they are offline.
Michelle.
Yeah, and we at CDT, we do everything from free expression, open internet, and I do privacy, that's my beat. And we talk about the digital self. And we now, as human beings, have a digital self too that represent everywhere we go, who we know, what we do, what we eat, what we read, our religion, our politics, right? And when put together, can paint an incredibly detailed picture of our lives. And that can be used for good and bad. And we are tech enthusiasts, but that also means we accept that technology has been seamlessly integrated into every part of our lives. And so we need to move forward with that as the basis of our understanding. And we need to move beyond the conversation from the last 10 years. A lot of it has been about, well, if you don't like something about technology, opt out, right? Just don't use it. No one is forcing you to use Facebook. But we have now come into a point in society where your car is connected, your fridge is connected, your kid's school maybe uses laptops. They can't even do their homework, right, on paper anymore. You have to use it for work. You walk by connected cameras on the street. We're just in an always-on society, and so we need to proceed from the presumption that this data will be created about us and collected by people constantly. So let's start talking about what institutions owe us then. That means our government, but also companies too. This is no longer an issue for self-management, for individuals to try to control themselves. It is much bigger than that. So we are looking forward to the next round of debate about technology and where it is going to really try to shift the burden back on companies and to some extent the government to make sure that they are treating us fairly when they are handling our data.
That's interesting, and we'll get into kind of a comparative analysis of where the United States is. But actually, Adrian, Freedom House just published a report which ranked countries' internet freedom profiles. Can you talk to us about what the goal of that report was and perhaps some of the key findings around the US and China and perhaps other countries as well?
Yeah, certainly. So the Freedom on the Net report had its pilot edition in 2009, and I mentioned what was happening in Iran around that time where there was a disputed presidential election, and Iranians had taken to the streets en masse to film the protests, post about it on Twitter, sort of organize and share information, both inside of the country and also to bring that information outside to the rest of the world so that we can all know what's happening inside the country. And at that point, we thought it would be very interesting to sort of start up a new index. We have our Freedom in the World Index, which has been going for several decades now, which ranks countries according to how free their political rights and civil liberties are. And we thought it'd be interesting to look at how free is each country's internet. And by that I mean, we're looking at obstacles to internet access, whether people are actually able to get online, how costly are internet connections. We also look at any limitations on content, so what websites are blocked or what social media tools aren't available in those countries. And then also looking at what sort of protections are available for people's fundamental rights, whether that's freedom of expression, privacy, or even their own physical security. And it's now, we released the 8th edition of the Freedom on the Net report in November. And unfortunately, every year we've seen a decline in internet freedom scores. And by that I mean there have been more countries that have declined than those that have improved. The best countries have generally been Iceland and Estonia. Generally speaking, Iceland, there's not too much going on there, so they have it pretty easy. But Estonia is an interesting case because this is a country that was actually the victim of a massive cyber attack by many suspect Russia a few years ago. And after that, Estonian authorities built up this entire sort of cyber strategy for the country, and since then has really been on the cutting edge of a lot of these digital issues of e-government or even internet freedom. And then, as you mentioned, the United States recently fell. It's sort of middling around like 5th or 6th place, generally speaking, and in 2018 was ranked in 6th place. And that country went down by 1 point because of the repeal of the net neutrality regulations. And generally speaking, we witnessed a sort of uptick in hyper-partisan and content or even sort of fake news and the impact that that was having on the digital media landscape. On the other side of the spectrum is China, which ranks dead last. We don't cover, I should mention that we don't cover the likes of North Korea because it'd just be too hard to get the information. But we do cover 65 countries, which translates to around 87% of the world's internet users. And we found that, so we rank each country according to its internet freedom scores, and we have categories for free, partly free, and not free. And we found that over the past year, 1/3 of all internet users around the world actually reside in a country that we characterize as not free. And so that means either the internet is difficult to access, or even if internet penetration rates are very high, like in a country like Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, there are very strict limitations on what you can read or post online. Surveillance is rampant. The government often uses these military-grade malware tools in order to infect activists' cell phones and monitor all of their activities. So generally speaking, we've seen that whereas we've always looked at this as internet freedom, so that the internet is bringing about freedom, China sort of symbolizes the opposite side of the spectrum. And the main finding that we came across last year is actually how China is exporting its own model of internet governance around the world. We call that digital authoritarianism. And that symbolizes the way that China as an authoritarian government is increasingly making use of technology in order to govern society in a way where it is repressing its own citizens, controlling what people are saying and reading online. And that now we've seen where several countries around the world are sort of following that model, in part because of the rise of fake news or these kind of data breaches that are happening in the sort of American or European internets. And so China sort of has an easier argument to saying, look at all the difficult things, look at all the problems that the United States or Europe are dealing with. Why don't you, follow our way of developing the internet, where you're able to close off the country from the rest of the world, essentially, where the government has complete control of what people are saying and doing online in a way that's very different to the more open, decentralized internet that exists in the United States or Europe and many other free countries.
That's interesting. It seems that advancements in technology outpace our ability to protect our personal privacy with respect to data collection. And I know that Facebook just recently announced that they were consolidating all of their applications under one umbrella and have committed to being more secure, which has caused concern among, or at least caused questions with respect to law enforcement and intelligence agencies who have long relied on social media for important data. Michelle or Elizabeth, can either of you comment on or explain what are the types of data that is out, what are out there, how are they being collected, and what are the implications for law enforcement and even intelligence agencies as well?
So pretty much everything is connected now and collecting information. And we usually think of it in certain categories like wearables, right? So they're going to collect information about your body. Home devices, home IoT. So that is most famously Alexa, right? But that is now also your thermostat, your doorbell, your refrigerator, your mattress, right? And they're often put through a hub where all that information is consolidated into one place. Then you have your actual smartphone, which is probably one of the biggest collectors since we all have it with us everywhere we go. A study actually said most people never have it more than 5 feet away from them at any given time, which is kind of scary. You sleep with it on your nightstand. But all of these things serve to collect location, associations, and it really affects everything about what you know, what you do, where you go. And it turns out we are all incredibly unique, but we're also incredibly predictable. right? So once you get someone's pattern once, you can always predict where they're going to be and what they're doing and who they're doing it with. So once you start creating a longitudinal collection of data on someone, you really can foresee what is going to happen to them in the future.
It is remarkable. Can I just follow up on that?
Yes, please do.
It is remarkable, and it is a lot of information, and it is true that law enforcement agencies around the world are very focused on trying to get that information from tech companies and others who hold it. I think we've seen a lot of different reactions to most of the global tech companies, really resist requests from authoritarian regimes for that type of data on users because of the concerns about how it would be used. And there are a lot of different tactics that we see in terms of how law enforcement responds to that. Data localization bills are something we're seeing come up all over the place. India is working on one that would have a huge impact. Russia has one that's in place as law, but it's pulling the plug on companies that don't comply. And so there are different responses. I think encryption's another area. I think tech companies think encryption is really important, and even in free societies like the United States, there are still fights over whether or not people should be entitled to use encryption to secure their communications, if it means that law enforcement won't be able to access it. Australia recently passed a law about encryption that would require a level of technical assistance that would allow them to compel companies to build in faults to systems. It's the same backdoor we've always been talking about. So there are a lot of challenges, and we really see governments across the world responding in different ways.
Adrian, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on something that Elizabeth mentioned. And that was one of the other findings. Sorry, our report's very long, so I didn't want to go through the entire thing. But it's available on our website for anybody interested. But one of the other findings just so happens to be that many countries are sort of looking at the various data breaches that have happened. Also, different scandals, in 2013, the scandal around the NSA and Edward Snowden. That has led to many governments wanting to sort of enforce their own sovereignty online, and this growing notion of data sovereignty, that the state should have access to all data and information that's coming in and out of its borders in the same way that it controls sort of people coming in and out of its borders. And that's where we found that of the 65 countries that we covered, just over the past year, 18 countries passed laws that gave the government greater access to data. And by that, one of those is data localization. That's the idea that a government like Russia, for example, can force a company, whether that's Facebook or Google, to store all of the data that it has on Russian citizens inside of the country. And that's, you would think theoretically that's not always a bad thing. Why not have it in the country? But when it's a country like Russia, where there's not so great rule of law, where the government is known to target political opponents, that then makes Russian citizens worried. And so this is sort of I think the interesting tension is that in a lot of countries, people actually trust tech companies more than they trust their own government. And then I think right now, we're sort of in this moment where the pendulum is swinging, at least in the United States, where we're hoping to get the government on our side to sort of help against the power of tech companies.
One of the questions I had for you, Elizabeth, is it seems like after 9/11, the conversation around privacy was how do we secure our country while protecting our civil liberties? That was kind of the crux of it. Since that time, it seems like how do we protect ourselves, our civil liberties, first and foremost, and then how do we work with the private and public sectors to do so as well? What are your insights or thoughts about the state of privacy law or regulations currently in the US? What would be your kind of ideal privacy law for where we are right now, knowing that things might change?
Right. I think just the state of play right now, it's very splintered. And that causes confusion for consumers. It also causes confusion for the companies that need to comply with laws. So we're seeing many multinational companies need to comply with the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, which received a lot of news when it went into effect last May. We also hear a lot about California's new law, the California Consumer Protection Act. And I think what we're looking for is both of those have good ideas. But I think what we're missing right now is a comprehensive, but also kind of a uniquely American approach to privacy. I don't think you can take GDPR and just transplant it to the United States. And in terms of California, I think it's too narrow. I think we actually need more protections for consumers than what California offers. So we're looking at things that really give users rights over their personal information, rights to access, correct, delete, move to other providers if they choose. Obviously to be informed about how their information is used and to be protected from uses that aren't consistent with their expectations, and at least have choice with regard to those things.
And in the background for this is that we wrote our privacy laws decades ago, and we did it sectorally, right? So your education, your communication, your banking records. And so now the vast majority of the information is completely unregulated. And for us, what's most important is that we actually go beyond individual control. It's not realistic anymore. My boss just testified before Congress, and before she went, she counted how many apps she had on her phone, and it was over 260. Okay. Now that's just her cell phone. That doesn't count what's in her house, her online accounts.
Wow.
It doesn't count how many third parties the data is shared with. I mean, there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of companies touching your data every single day. You can't micromanage that, right? So this is our moment to say, what do we expect from companies? How do we expect them to treat us? What are our digital civil rights that can't be signed away? And for us, there are some clear priorities. Things like data should not be repurposed if it's especially sensitive. Things like biometrics, right? Once it's out there, it can't be changed. This is one of the most sensitive things. Children's data, health information. If you give it to them for a certain service, that's all they could use it for, right? They can't sell it. They can't share it on the open market. And also discrimination. This is the other thing that is happening, is that it is speeding up discriminatory practices and hiding them in a way in the internet that you just can't go back and restructure. And that's just really old school discrimination, housing, education, employment. An advertisement comes up and it exists for a single person for a half a second, and then it's gone forever. So what does that mean? How do we make our civil rights still relevant in 2019? So those are the types of things we hope to see in a federal law. It's clearly time for it. We are decades behind. We have so much debt to make up for that we really have to get started. We are behind other countries who, technologically are, they don't even have the same internet, but they are already considering these issues. So now's the time for the US to catch up.
Well, and definitely through the program that I run, Girl Security, there's a lot of adolescent girls who will ask questions like, I said out loud to my mom that I wanted oatmeal, and all of a sudden I got online and there were ads for oatmeal on my computer. Are they watching me? And so even thinking forwardly for future generations, we're already behind the curve. And on top of that, we talked about there have been some major big data events certainly in the last few months, in the last few years. I thought it might be useful for the audience to kind of deconstruct some of those big data events that are in front of our eyes every day that we read the news and create certainly insecurity. And Adrian, I thought you might be able to talk a little bit about China's social credit system and what it is and how it functions.
Sure.
What are the implications of a system like that?
Sure. Should I jump in on China?
Yes.
So China has this social credit system, and it's very complicated, in part because it's been so misreported, especially early on. So there are essentially two different things going on at the same time, both equally creepy. One is that the government has a blacklist of citizens who have failed in some type of civic duty, whether that's they've failed to pay a fine on time, perhaps they have acted a bit rowdy on a train, whatever it might be, that sort of gets them onto a blacklist. And then this set of blacklists are then used in order to determine whether a citizen has access to all sorts of general public services. And so you might have seen in the news, I think it was around 20 million people recently were actually just suddenly saw that they had been banned from using train networks in China because they were on a government blacklist. Separately, there is this thing called Sesame Credit, or there's essentially this move by the government to actually push the private sector into developing its own sort of alternatives of the FICO credit score that we have in the United States. And the idea here, sort of behind both, is that the Chinese government is hoping to create a sense of trustworthiness, they call it, in society. And there have been many people who say perhaps that's a good thing. You know, we do need to create some kind of social ethics that people are aware that there are consequences for being, rowdy on a train or whatever it might be. On the other hand, whenever we bring in technology, as Michelle was talking about, there are all sorts of questions around transparency, around due process, around discrimination that come into play. So when somebody finds that they are part of a government blacklist in China, how do they go about even knowing that they're on the blacklist? How do they go and dispute the charge? Who do they turn to and then go through a sort of fair trial? And instead, when a lot of this is just done by either algorithms or behind the scenes, we found that actually we're sort of outsourcing what happens in a democracy with a judicial system, with lawyers, to just technology, and with the hope that technology is going to figure it all out. And we don't need all of these pesky democratic values. And instead, I think the general question is, what happens when we start to take on this very technocratic sense of how to govern society? And it's not only China. I think some of the same tools that we're using to govern society, whether that's even Facebook or Google and technology companies here at home, there are certain questions when it comes to maybe content moderation or privacy where a company is perhaps not the best judge of deciding what free speech means in a democratic society. We have laws, we have politicians, we have a whole process for debating these very intense political discussions. And instead, when that's sort of outsourced to a technocrat or a coder, whether that's in Silicon Valley or in China, we see that oftentimes the solutions are a little bit perhaps naive or don't take into consideration the ways that the system can be abused. And instead, I think with the social credit system, it's scary not only for those in China, but the idea that, with China on the rise, is this going to be the future, not only in China, but are we going to learn, China's WeChat apps are like some of the most advanced technology that we have, and slowly some of that technology kind of gets melded into US or European apps. And I think the question becomes, what happens when the system either becomes so good or so efficient, or perhaps just so powerful, that it then spreads to other countries around the world? Or even that US companies and US individuals are then going to have to play by China's rules, either when they're doing business in China or also just in international negotiations.
So in the US and our democracy, privacy as a civil liberty is one of our key strengths, as is our electoral process. It's a timely conversation topic here in Chicago as well as nationally. Can you comment on, Michelle or Elizabeth to start, what are the actual risks to our electoral process and how have they changed in the last 2 years? And then I guess the question to wrap up is, how do we build resilience? What are our key strengths within the United States to build resilience to continued similar attacks?
Well, I think the election work has been really surprising to people over the last couple of years. And the original discussion was more about, will they attack physical systems that will interfere with the actual voting process? And we've now changed the discussion to, can they actually change the debate in a country, right? Can they actually change what we understand about our own representatives and our own values? Can they capitalize on problems that already exist in our country through legal measures oftentimes? So it has changed from more of a defensive conversation about hardware and systems to, are there norms that we can build in the United States to make us better recognize when someone is trying to interfere? I have to say, I don't know that anyone has the right answer on this yet, but it is still new. I know it feels like we've been talking about this for a very long time, but we really haven't. As far as the scope of democracy itself, this is such a tiny little point that I think we are all still mustering through.
I think there's no doubt that the internet industry was taken by surprise by the misinformation and kind of influence campaigns that the Russian government in particular carried out with regard to the US election. They've taken a lot of steps, but I think this is one of the areas where all these issues finally come together. Big data, freedom of speech. As Michelle said, many of these activities were perfectly legal. And I think, as American companies, many of the internet companies do value freedom of expression and have been reluctant to take measures against speech if it doesn't violate US laws. And we're clearly moving into a phase where more is expected, but I think drawing those lines is really hard. But even when those lines get drawn, then the question comes, how do they enforce on the platforms? And this is where we run into the big data and privacy question, because looking at the profiles of a member of the Internet Research Agency on Twitter, even very sophisticated people, like Jack Dorsey, actually interacted with that content thinking it was legitimate, because on its face, it was not necessarily recognizable as something that was a foreign government trying to influence the election. So what you really have to do is dig layers and layers and layers down and bring together all types of data points to be able to see maybe this one profile looks okay, but once you dig layers and layers below, you see that it's connected to thousands of other profiles, and they're all propping each other up to get spread across a network. And so, we have to, as a society, make some decisions about where we want to set the balance between our own personal privacy and having these types of protective measures put in place.
Great. On that point, we are going to open up questions to the audience. Across the room, we have microphones. Please wait for you to be called on and for a microphone to arrive. Also, please ensure that your question ends with a question mark and is not a statement. You can also submit questions through our conference IO, which is chi.cnf.io. All right, we have this lady. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Jennifer Gardy, I'm Deputy Director of Surveillance, Data, and Epidemiology at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with an asterisk on surveillance that it's like communicable disease surveillance, not nefarious surveillance. And I was curious because the unit of data that I work in is populations as opposed to individuals. So I wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on to what extent does working with population level data rather than individual data both open you up to new possibilities and avoid some of the issues that were discussed tonight, and at the same time also open the door to sort of a new Pandora's box. So what are the advantages and the challenges of working with population level data?
Well, I was going to say, I would say we're kind of like on the downside of this, where we're realizing some of the techniques we used to use to obscure individual identities are no longer working because there's too much data out there, right? Oracle, in its advertising materials, claims it has 30,000 data points on each individual. Right, you could take the name off that, and who cares? You know exactly who it is, right? So I think more work needs to be done to see if there are technical solutions of ways to process large amounts of data that protect people. But I mean, I think, you know, if you're in the health space, though, they have been leaders. They had to have peer-reviewed studies and go through specific processes that the rest of technology does not have to go through. And so I think our question is, how do we build that out for everybody else?
Can I add to that? I was just going to say, I think context is really matters when it comes to a question like that. I agree with Michelle. I think privacy-enhancing technologies are an important area where we continue investing so that we can do that kind of research. And you know, in some cases, looking at what people do individually, but within a community can help a lot, whether it's a communicable disease or it's traffic and you're trying to get to work and you're using Waze. So, you know, we want to be able to enable those uses while still respecting people's privacy. So I think technology will make a big difference.
Yeah, and one of the stories that actually came out recently was on Strava, which was something that was such a clear cut. It was a wearable for exercise purposes, and while they weren't releasing individual data, they would release data sets, and it clearly revealed a military base overseas and where all of the soldiers were doing their jogs around the base, right? And so there's an example where something emerged from a big set of data that would have seen otherwise there, you know, in a harmful way, right, and not a good way. So it's something that I think still feels really new from the last few years that we're trying to understand this, but so there are risks and rewards there to large sets of data.
Great. This gentleman up here in the left, my left, your right. Thank you.
Hi. With the development of global record locators and the ability to have de-identified global record locators, what do you think the possibility is of having auditability for every individual to be able to see where are all the places that their data is being used and by whom?
Well, we don't think that's possible. And we believe people should have some rights if they choose to exercise them. I guess there's the problem of backwards looking, right? Even if we put a law in place now, we have decades of data collection, and being able to reconnect where everything went will probably be impossible to some extent. But because decisions are made on you even without it changing hands, for example, right? Does that count? Do you want to know everyone who's made a decision on you even if they don't have your data? What about their service providers or third parties? It's going to be the ads you see, right? It would be literally thousands and thousands of companies. And so the question then becomes, what is the value in knowing that every company that exists has your data at some point in your life, right? What are you supposed to do with that in a meaningful way?
Well, a quick follow-up, and I don't know if there's time, but it would be the concept of having like a do not call list, but just a digital version of that.
Yeah. You want to do not track?
I mean, I think there are different things that can be done with technology. I think that there are trade-offs if we want to try and get to a system where we have the same sort of persistent identifier as a telephone number or other thing like that. And I think device identifiers, well, they in many instances are uniquely identifying. As I checked into my hotel today, I walked by a Mac that was just available for use. I don't want anyone else to know if I sat down there, what I searched for on Google. So I think that is something that you really have to carefully balance out what the costs and benefits are.
A question that came through our conference IO that sort of built on some of this. As the father of a 2-year-old, how would you advise that I protect his data and educate him in the need to avoid apps, social media, etc.?
Well, perhaps.
I can take that one if you
Yeah.
I mean, my advice to any parent is to be responsible for your children's data. Myself, I don't post pictures of my little ones online. To the extent that I can protect their data, I do. We have a lot of young girls in our program who are 15 or 16 who ask the question, which raises some First Amendment issues of why don't I need a license to drive the internet? I'm just given an iPad in the 4th or 5th or 6th grade. So I think just having a conversation from a very young age with children about what data privacy looks like and the costs of privacy and security is very beneficial. I talked to my 3-year-old daughter, who I'm celebrating on International Women's Day, said to me today, don't take that picture of me. How would you like if I followed you around with a camera? And I thought, all right, I'm training her well. So you can have a conversation with a young person at a young age about what privacy looks like. We talk about it in different settings. We just have to frame it within the context of data.
Well, and I guess that does bring up something. I don't know about the very little ones, but people keep saying, young people don't care about privacy, and they actually do. They know more about it, and they are actually just native users of all of these apps and services, and so they're actually really good at hiding things from their parents.
Very good at hiding things.
Yeah, so, right, if you're like, oh, my children don't have social media, yes, they do. You just don't know about it, right? So I think they are definitely smart enough, and they understand the stakes, and they're actually good at context and control and audiences, and so maybe it's better explaining to them the consequences of what happens if you don't make those decisions and how you control it. Your employer someday, right, or your college that you're applying to. Colleges are now going through social media of their applicants to see what they're like in the real life. So
that's the irony, is they're very good at hiding their data from their parents, but they really express little concern about the government collecting their data. Now, Russia, that takes it to a different level. So
I would also say, as a society, I think we're becoming more aware that all of us need perhaps healthier online habits, and looking at the amount of time we're spending interacting with the phone. So I would just add that as another consideration as you're raising a child, is thinking about like what part the technology and the services and the apps should play in life, just in general.
I think also there's something around, it's not only 2-year-olds, it's also our parents and grandparents as well. And something that has sort of been in the news recently with Mark Zuckerberg's recent announcement about changes to Facebook. I think there's sort of a misunderstanding among the average citizen that privacy is just using all the Facebook tools and saying, okay, this is going to be a private post. That means that all of my friends perhaps aren't going to be able to see it. But that doesn't really get to the wider question of what can Facebook know about you by even just logging onto the platform? Even if you're not a Facebook user, what does Facebook know about you? So I think sometimes our initial sense of what privacy means in terms of, well, I'm surfing the internet and I'm not putting my name anywhere, how that actually is paying very close attention to, this post is only going to be friends only. Like my privacy is great. Just knowing the sort of behind the scenes ways that our private data is being collected and processed.
Great. Lots of questions. Wonderful. This gentleman with the green. Yes, you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so Elizabeth.
It's all right. I'm colorblind. Sorry. It's my bad.
So Elizabeth, I heard you mention that GDPR and CCPA might not be going far enough in terms of individual rights to privacy. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Mark Warner's Internet Bill of Rights, to see if that is going far enough or if potentially something more needs to come out.
Well, I think I think there are a lot of great starts. There have been many versions of an Internet Bill of Rights that we've seen over the years, and I think they all have really important components. And as I said, I kind of listed some of the rights. I think you find those in GDPR. I think what is kind of a different question and one of the reasons why GDPR maybe doesn't translate as well to the United States is this notion of the right to be forgotten, which, because of our First Amendment, I think it would be very uncomfortable to try and implement something like that here, because it doesn't just apply to your own speech. So it's not about the eraser button, as we've heard mentioned before as an idea, but it also impacts others' speech. And I think, so for that reason, GDPR may not be the right fit, but I also agree with what Michelle said earlier, which is, yes, it's very important that that users have these rights, but it's not just about users having those rights. You also need the other piece, which is the companies need to be required to handle the data responsibly and face consequences if they get it wrong. So I think, if we can find the right way to write a privacy law that gives users absolute rights to control their information and exercise choice and have transparency, that's great. And then we also need to find just a structure that works to have the right rules of the road for companies in terms of their business processes and how they're handling user data.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yes. Yes, you now.
Adrian, you referenced the rankings of nations, free internet to very unfree. Within the particular countries like China, for instance, on average it's not free, but is there some sort of distribution where in some sectors like the academy there is more freedom and generally there's not, or does the lack of freedom apply throughout?
It's a good question. And I will point you, for anything that I can't say, I'd also welcome you to go visit. We have a report on China, specifically in internet freedom conditions there, which again is very long, so I won't be able to summarize it all, but that's available on our website. What strikes me within China, it's interesting because so many people are actually using VPNs within the country, particularly if you are working within a corporation. And there's when you're using a VPN, that's essentially a tunnel into a freer internet. And there are, VPNs are not a surefire way of protecting your privacy or being able to evade censorship, but it works pretty well. And I think there are people who have access, like a certain cluster of society that has access to VPNs that is able to jump the so-called Great Firewall. And oftentimes what we've seen in our research is that the first sites that they access when they sort of jump the Great Firewall are actually Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So there is a lot of hunger for those the very popular services from the US. The other aspect is that there are actually places that are far less free than the average citizen. And by that, particularly the western region of Xinjiang, where there's this restive minority population where there's been a very tense relationship to the central government. This is where the Uyghur Muslims and other Muslim minorities are based. And there, China has essentially built this almost techno-dystopia of sorts, where there are facial recognition cameras on every street. There are apps that the locals have to download onto their phones, essentially spyware apps that allow the government to monitor who they are talking to and what they're saying. So there are definitely some different degrees of freedom within the country, obviously according to social and class, but then also to whether you belong to a discriminated minority. And I haven't even touched on what's happening in Tibet province. That's something very different. But yeah, you can tell how in these regions where there's sort of breakaway republics, the central government has a very different approach to the local residents.
Great. We have one last question. Would the panelists be more worried about big data collection and misuse by governments or by private corporations? A real zinger at the end.
I can start. I do think it's governments. And the reason I remember right after the Snowden revelations, I think it was, there was an article from The Economist that had the headline, should the government know as much data as Google does? And I thought that was a really interesting question because, we're scared of the government getting access to all of this data, but we happily hand it over to Google or Facebook. I think at the end of the day, what matters is the potential harm that can happen from handing over this data or this data being exposed. And whether it's at the hands of your government that has the ability to sort of restrict your own physical freedom, or also at the hands of a foreign government that has the ability to take your data and sort of manipulate you or bribe you to a certain direction. And I think generally speaking, what I'm most worried about is with advances in artificial intelligence, we're going to be using sort of big data to make decisions about what we can and can't do in society, or what sort of we have access to in society. Maybe our healthcare, maybe getting into universities. And as the technology advances, the sort of AI algorithms are going to be able to make decisions and then not be able to explain why they have made that decision. And I think that's really damaging to our sense of accountability, knowing why we've been denied some type of right. And it also makes it that we can't go and contest that decision. So I think those are sort of where I come on. It's sort of a mixed answer, I guess, but I think definitely the government, I'm more afraid of the government.
Well, and why do we have to choose, right? I really
Why do
don't
we have
think
to choose?
I have plenty of outrage for both. And, I will say, though, that over the last 20 years, or 30 years, there have been no major steps to rein in government collection of information, frankly. So I think the moment right now that what we should be seizing is scoping what is collected, used, and shared by companies. Because that actually is where the government gets that data in the first place, right? At least in this country, I should say. It's different in other countries where they're actually operating the internet. And, they're very different stakes, but, the internet is no longer frivolous. I think people always talk about who cares about the ads or Facebook, but, it is determining what type of ads people see for mortgage rates and the jobs they apply for and the colleges they're going to go to. These are like life-altering things, right? And so this is very serious, and it's everyday, it's persistent, and it's opaque. So I say companies. Let's do companies now.
And you're a tiebreaker.
Well, probably no surprise to anyone which way I would go, but I would actually say I think we do have to tackle it as being a continuum. I don't think it's a black or white choice. And in fact, we not only do the surveillance laws in the United States need to be updated, but we're also seeing increasing efforts to regulate a lot of the new sharing economy companies at the local level by trying to require them to turn over in real time large amounts of data. There was, I think it was an LA Times story just in the last day or so about scooters and requiring scooter companies to provide data on where all the scooters are in real time. And I think, that just shows that we can't necessarily have it one way or the other. And so we have to think about the consequences every time we give information. And the people who collect information need to think about it from both directions.
On that note, I want to thank Elizabeth, Adrian, Michelle, and Lauren for joining us on their thoughtfulness in such a timely topic. I want to thank you all for joining us here at the Council today and invite you to join us for a glass of wine and perhaps continuing this very vigorous conversation.